Alrighty, everyone. We are making our way into our coverage of the latter modernist poets that we covered in our two modern poetry modules. And a couple of figures who I've sort of labeled as like transitional figures. They're modernists who perhaps in certain ways almost anticipate a movement called pre-modernism, which I will speak about at the end of all of this modernist poetry coverage, because it pertains to our drama readings that you guys have been working on this week coming up to Monday. I want to start, I think because it's going to take a bit more talking about, I want to start with our Villanelle from this last couple of weeks. It's called Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas's poem. Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. The book you just saw, The Making of a Poem, a Norton Anthology of Poetic Forms by Strand and Boland, is an excellent, excellent quick reference on basically all formal poetry, or like on the forms that poets use. Sonnet form, haiku form, pantoum form, the Villanelle, as we will see. The Villanelle is a form that is close to my heart and still like fairly popular among serious poets. It's not everywhere, but it's still being used. And I'm going to read you a little bit of information from this book that I think will put it into context. First, I'm going to read a summary of what the rules are, the formal rules. The Villanelle is pretty intricate, pretty complex. I'm going to read the rules. They're not going to make any sense to you. You'll be like, oh my god, what? But then I'll read a different Villanelle, one that's not on our course, maybe a couple of samples, and then we'll read Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle, and you'll start to get a sense of the pattern. Oh, this is how they do it. Okay, and then it'll make sense. And I can post the information, this sort of overview of the rules on Populi if anybody's interested. You won't be quizzed on it, on like knowing the rules of a Villanelle. You will probably earn extra points if you can identify this poem as a Villanelle. But the certain kinds of repetition in it would probably tweak you enough that you would recognize it. In any case, we'll dive right in. So, a Villanelle is a poem of 19 lines. It has 5 stanzas, 3 lines long each, plus 1 of 4 lines long. So in total, there are 6 stanzas. The first 5 are what are called tercets, 3 lines long, and the final stanza is a quatrain, 4 lines. We're familiar with that. The first line of the first tercet is repeated as the last line of the second and fourth tercets. The third line of the first tercet is repeated as the last line of the third and fifth tercets. So I did tell you you're going to be like, blah, but trust me, it'll all come out in the wash. You'll start to see it. These 2 refrain lines, so the first and last line of the initial tercet, they alternate in the following stanzas as refrains. They come back and come back and come back. These 2 refrain lines follow each other to become the second to last, or penultimate, and last, or ultimate, lines of the poem. So those 2 refrains that are the bookends of the first tercet, they become the final pair of the poem overall. So this sort of circling pattern of the refrain lines in almost a helical progression comes together in this crunch of kind of a clarified final point. There's this oomph at the end when they finally meet. And that is a big part of the Villanelle's effect and effectiveness. I'm going to read you a little tiny bit about the background of a Villanelle, the history of it, like how it evolved. Again, this is from Strand and Boland. It hardly seems likely that a form so sparkling and complicated as the Villanelle could have had its origin in an Italian harvest field. In fact, it came from an Italian rustic song, the term itself, Villanella, thought to derive from Viano, an Italian word for peasant, or even villa, the Latin word for country house or farm. If it was a round song, something sung with repetitive words and refrains, it may have taken its first, long-lost shape as an accompaniment to the different stages of an agricultural task, binding sheaves, perhaps, or even scything, a work song. basically. A call and response, repetitive, group sung, round song, work song. No actual trace of this early origin remains. By the time the Villanelle emerges into poetic history, it does so as a French poem with pastoral themes. Now, the reason that I bring up this theory about the Villanelle's history as possibly a work song is because, to me, that is exactly what the Villanelle does for writers and readers as a form. The function of this structure with the refrains that alternate and eventually come together, and the rhymes that have to adhere themselves to these refrains, to me, this form lends itself to a poet's working through and working through and working through in a ruminative, repetitive, paper shredder, staring at your ceiling at night kind of way, some very difficult problem that just does not want to resolve, trying to untangle some knot or put together some few pieces that just don't want to mesh. There's a struggle and a project that gets worked out through the structures of a villanelle, which I think that makes sense if you think of it as having a history as a work song that would have accompanied repetitive tasks, outdoors or on a job site. Before we get into Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, I'm going to read you one other villanelle that is so dear to my heart by a poet. She's quite a recent poet. I think she lived for sure into the 21st century, Elizabeth Bishop. And this villanelle is called One Art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. It's the first line of the first tercet. So many things seemed filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. That's that second refrain. Disaster. Master and disaster are going to be our refrain rhymes, and all the other rhymes are going to find their way into fitting to those. And indeed, that ends up being the theme of the poem, trying to figure out how to master disaster. Not to control it, but to master just how to even cope when it happens to you. How do you master the art of having your life fall apart? One Art, the title of the poem. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel, none of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you. This first line of the final quatrain begins with a dash. Dash. Even losing you, open parenthesis, the joking voice, a gesture I love, that goes over the line break. I'll show it to you here and hopefully you can see. Is it showing up there? Am I showing you the right piece? There you go. There's the dash. Even losing you. And that parenthesis goes over the line break. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master. Though it may look like, and then again in parentheses, italicized with an exclamation point, write it. Though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So she talks about all these things she's lost and all the and mental discipline and personal growth, it's taken her to get to the point where she can say none of those losses were disasters. And then at the end, where she's now lost deepest and fastest and hardest and worst, she says, even losing you, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master. And the final line is essentially, though it may look like disaster, but there's this exclamation of her heart in the midst of it, from the back of her mind, saying, write it. Write these things that are happening to you. Process them on paper. Process them in words, and you'll get there, which is exactly what she's done. It's exactly what the Villanelle form has done for her or enabled her to do. That's Elizabeth Bishop's one art. Sort of including it as another great example of a Villanelle, partly to help you understand what's going on in Dylan Thomas's poem, but also just in case any of you take an interest in this and maybe want to kick it around for the final paper. So, Dylan Thomas, the reading on our course. Do not go gentle into that good night. I thought I had this open, but I had that other thing open. Okay, so having heard Elizabeth Bishop's poem, having got a sense of the rhyme and pattern, do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. We talk sometimes about being at deathbeds where the person who's dying can't let go, and how difficult that can be. This poem is a son, an adult son, going hammer and tongs at his own inability to let go. Not just of his father, but of his own life. It's like seeing his father coming to death is putting him in confrontation with his own mortality and how much he does not want to die, and how he fully intends to go kicking and screaming and digging in his nails. And it's like he wants his father to demonstrate lust for life even in death by resisting death. He wants to know that his father is attached to the world and to him, and that he will miss them. It's only natural to rage against the dying of the light. And there's a deep anxiety here about, we don't know what comes next. Maybe nothing comes next. If this is it, if this is the whole thing, and death is the dying of the light, rage, rage against it. Do not go gentle into that good night. And he admits that it is good. But he has this deeply conflicted relationship with it. And so the whole poem is kind of him working through the kinds of people who live all different kinds of lives, and the way that for various reasons they come to the end and they resist hard. And he wants his father to do the same. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. There's that tension. Fierce tears at this point. would be awful, terrible to witness. They would be a curse. And he's saying, even be mad at me, right? Rage. Show me your anger, your vitality, your resistance. Don't be dying. Just don't do it. Curse me. Bless me. Bless me now with your fierce tears. I pray do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Heavy, heavy stuff. There's a whole different caliber of pain and darkness and loss that people have turned to the Villanelle to help them process. We talk about the sonnet as being a form that is very strict and very compact and good for working out the big, scary, unwieldy themes of life in love, death, God. And that's true. The Villanelle is a lot like that. But I think because of its tensions and its cyclical qualities, it seems to lend itself particularly to expressions of emotion that are unresolved. A lot like Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem Dirge Without Music. That's kind of her refrain in that poem. I am not resolved. I haven't looked up whether Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote any villanelles. I hope she did, or I wish she had of, one of the two, but in any case, that was a brainwave I just had right this second. That is the Villanelle, and more specifically Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Click on over to the next video for a few others of our latter modernist and early pre-modernist readings.